there's a certain wound that we get as men, partly because we do not get the father we want. James Hillman said, you know, every father comes into the world with a certain way that he wants to father. And every son comes into the world with a certain way that he wants to be fathered. And what if they don't match? I wanted a really companionable father. I wanted a funny father. I wanted a father who was sort of excitable and enthusiastic and would carry me up into high laughters and into wild plots, and an Irish father in a way. But what I got was a father who was serious, determined, and taught that there were certain bounds one couldn't go across, period. And a lot of the rest of it was silence. So I began to try to do, because our disappointment is so big when we don't get the father we want, that I simply never mentioned him in poems at all. I didn't even want to go into that disappointment. Does that make any sense to you? Finally, he gets to be 80 years old, he's in an old people's home, and I decided I must go into it now, or it's never going to happen. So I used to write a poem whenever I'd go to see him in the old people's home. And I'll read you a poem that, it's about the third poem, I guess, I wrote for him. He was 86 then. And James Hillman had also mentioned that sometimes we receive a fathering from our father that we didn't want and that we haven't noticed yet and we haven't thanked him for. We may have received something from our fathers that we haven't even noticed that he gave yet, because it was in some area different than where we were looking. That was a wonderful remark, and I had it in my mind when I wrote this poem. It's called Remembering an Old Conversation. Happened I went to see him in the old people's home in Madison, Minnesota, and then he was taken to the hospital, and he was in the same room in the hospital in which I had visited him when he was drying out 35 years before that. It was the same room. Remembering an old conversation. You are 86 and suddenly fall asleep. Have you been with old people? They're gone. You are 86 and suddenly fall asleep. Would you have been proud of me if I had lived more like you? In this same room, you drying out 35 years ago, you said to me, are you happy? Happiness is not one of the aims I have for my life. That's what I said. I was 27. You were alarmed. I was afraid, bluffing, isolated as you. You have arrived now nearly at the last station. Shall I say you misspent your life? You stood vibrating on a threshing machine, pulleys, choppers, shakers below you, and you kept your balance mostly. I carried 4 children up from the earth and felt their love. And there was a woman on the earth who had a message for me, and it arrived. And the rest is what you would expect. Is it so with you? You who are listening. Now for the first time I can see your skull below your forehead, below your closed grape-like eyes. The modest, luminous thing has happened. What did we expect? What did we expect? So it ends there. There's another poem in which I say at the end how fierce he was in fighting through his life in the depression and all of that. And then I end it with saying, through this old warrior in you, you overlive, overwhelm, survive, get on top. You gave me this, and I do not refuse it. It is in me.
One of the issues for American men, I think, is that American men face most of their life alone. There's this separation, often from the family of origins. There's often large gaps between a father, for instance, and his children. The loss of the fraternities, I mean working fraternities and ritual fraternities, and the loss of male societies puts individual men in the workplace, going and coming from work and working often in a emotionally isolated way or style. Most of history, men have worked and played and danced with other men. Men have done things together, and this is a pretty recent thing, with men living great parts of their lives unrelated, not closely related, not linked in soul work with other men. Women maybe have it a lot worse in terms of the general cultural values. Where they do have some more shared experience of the society is with other women. And so men maybe have the upper hand in terms of the values of the society, but they experience most of that individually and often in a loneliness. The prevalence of heart attacks in men at a fairly young age, you can turn that around and say that there's an attack on men's hearts. Something has happened in the growing of men in this culture that causes their hearts to be attacked at a young age. And that has to do with this isolation. The undeveloped heart, the unbonded heart, the lonely heart is the one that gets attacked.
Men have always been loved for their activity. They go out, 2,000 years ago, and they invade the area of the animals, and they learn how to do that, and they kill them, and they bring them home, and they feed people. Or they become shamans, and they go into the area of the spirits, which is even more dangerous in the world of the animals. And they learn how to get along with, even outwit, hostile beings in the spirit world, and they heal. Men go out into the forest and start a farm all by themselves, or they start a business all by themselves. That fantastic activity is what they've always been loved for. I think both by women and by their children, by each other. But what is asked for now are passive men. Oftentimes in the corporation, they do not want an active man. They want a passive one who agrees to wear exactly the same suit as everyone else, and agrees not to say anything if they're poisoning the water that his children are drinking. Some at least of the separatist feminists now want a man who's passive and domestic. If they want a man at all, he's got to agree not to have an ounce of aggression in him, otherwise he'll be attacked day and night. So, and the church has always wanted passive men. They're called Catholic priests. So it's a horrendous situation. Women have not suffered such a deep shock, I think, because women in a contrary way or opposite way are becoming more active. They're coming out of a pool of vast passivity forced on them by church and state and cultural stuff. But as they look at that passivity, and see how dangerous it was to them. They're coming out of it. But one curious example of the passivity, I think, is that the women's movement was tremendously helpful for women, I think, even those who didn't participate in it. And it gave a lot of gifts to everyone. A lot of energy has entered with that. At the same time, since they were coming out of a place of not expressing anger, and they began expressing anger, a lot of the stuff said was unfair about men. All men are rapists, all lovemaking is a rape, etc. All men are exactly the same, they all belong in the Pentagon. Now, one of the oddest things is that the men have not answered that. That's an example of a strange kind of passivity. And if the older men don't answer it, the younger ones have to assume it's true.